Good afternoon. In today's reading video, we are going to start talking about fairy tales. And this is actually going to be a two-part video where I introduce fairy tales, and then the second part will be where I actually read our read aloud for today, our story for today, with some pictures to go along with it. So let's start talking about fairy tales. Fairy tales are a certain type of story that is fictional, meaning it's made up. They were told orally for many years. And if you remember when we talked about fables, the word orally means they were told by mouth. They were never written down. People just shared them with each other through word of mouth. Until two brothers named Jacob and Willem Grimm decided that they wanted to collect all these stories and record them or write them down so that people could have them to read. They lived in Germany about 200 years ago, but they wrote these stories down, and since they wrote them down, we still have them today to share and read. If you ask anyone at home, maybe a parent or a grandparent or an aunt or uncle, they've probably actually heard some of the fairy tales we're going to be reading because these brothers wrote them down, and so many people across the world have now shared them with each other. So let's talk about some characteristics of fairy tales, or those details or things that are true about fairy tales. So a lot of times when we read fairy tales, they begin with once upon a time. They won't always do that, but a lot of times they will. So when you hear fairy tales, listen for that, because you'll probably notice a lot of them start with that. They also have good characters. A lot of times these good characters are royalty, which we know as kings, queens, princes, and princesses. And a lot of times the good characters also include fairies, not always, but sometimes. They also have evil characters. We know evil means bad. A lot of times these evil characters or villains are witches, dragons, or stepmothers. These aren't the only three types of evil characters, but these are a couple common ones you'll see in fairy tales. Fairy tales also have fantasy. Now, fantasy is a special type of fiction, meaning it can't happen in real life. There's realistic fiction, meaning it's something that could happen even though it's in a story. For example, you might read a story about a boy who's on a soccer team. That can actually happen in real life. That's realistic fiction. But fantasy fiction is things that can't happen in real life. For example, a fairy putting a magical spell on a character. That can't happen in real life, so that's fantasy. And they also have magic, which you'll see a lot in fairy tales. Fairy tales also have personification, which we know from our fables and folk tales. Personification is when an animal does what? That's right, when an animal acts and talks like a human does. A lot of times in fairy tales, we'll also have a happy ending, and a lot of times you'll hear happily ever after, or they lived happily ever after at the end of a fairy tale. The settings in fairy tales are oftentimes castles, forests, or faraway lands. In fairy tales, the characters often face many problems and have many solutions to their problems. Not always. Sometimes there might be one major problem, but a lot of times you'll see many different problems that the characters have. In fairy tales, a lot of times the characters learn a lesson, which we know is called a moral. And in fairy tales, the character who is good is rewarded for their goodness, for choosing to do the right thing. These are all characteristics of fairy tales. So as we begin our unit on fairy tales, as we listen to our different fairy tales, I want you to pay attention for these things and see which ones you notice in our fairy tales.